start up again. And our guest speaker today is Mary Helen Fein. But before I tell you about her, let me tell you about our next speaker. Yes, in April 20th, Wednesday, we have Catherine Bramkamp, who will be giving a writing workshop. Fun, frantic, flash fiction. And it's in preparation for our 100-word story contest coming up that will be opening up in April. So check the newsletter for important information. And we hope you can join us on April 20th. Thank you. And I am Margie E. Webb. I'm the Director of Speaker Programs, and I am pleased to have our very own member, Mary Helen Fein, present to us. I want to tell you something about her. Mary Helen Fein is a writer and artist. She is the author of Stitching a Life, an immigration story. And her books are available in the back. You can check them out anytime during this talk. It's a historical novel based on the life of her grandmother, Helen Breakstone Fein, who emigrated from Lithuania to New York City in 1990. Mary?
1900.
Wow.
Oh, I'm sorry, 1900. Okay, good catch. Make sure you guys were awake. Mary Helen's first novel is Loss of Deliverance. She lived in Auburn with her husband and had owned Parallax Design Group, a website design and development company. Having retired, she keeps busy writing her third book, doing artwork, and designing and maintaining websites as a volunteer for nonprofits, including for Gold Country Writers.
Thank you.
Mary Helen is a certified teacher in Sentango, a meditative art form. At Spirit Rock Meditation Center in Marin County, she spent 5 years studying Buddhism and practicing meditation, and is authorized to teach meditation. Active in her local Buddhist community, Mountain Stream Meditation, she serves as president of their nonprofit board of directors. Also, she volunteers for the nonprofit Buddhist Global Relief. In February, Mary Helen was interviewed by New York City's Tenement Museum. Her virtual book talk was recorded, and you can watch it via their YouTube channel. Or there's also a link on our Gold Country Writers website. For more on Mary Helen, visit her website, maryhelenfein.com. She is presenting Writing Family History, a Process. Let's welcome Mary Helen Fein.
Nice and loud.
I'll try, but my voice will drop, so I want you to do this if my voice drops, okay? And hopefully I'll just remember to be nice and loud. So I'm very excited to be here. Thanks very much to everyone at Gold Country Writers and those who invited me to be this month's speaker. I didn't realize I would be the first post-COVID, dare we say those words, speaker, and I'm very excited about that. And thanks to all of you for coming out today. Very much appreciated. My talk will be about writing family history. So I just wanted to say a few words about family history in general. First of all, everybody has it. You don't get here without some family history. Uncovering your own family history may be easier or more difficult, depending on what's been done by those who came before. In this country, most of us have an immigration story. The tale of what brought your family to these shores. Immigration stories are worth telling and worth hearing. There are various reasons why people immigrate, and it's good to take a look at that. Some families emigrate because they are pushed. They're pushed out of their homeland by violence as a war breaks out, by hatred, racism, anti-Semitism that drives them out, such as what happened to my Jewish family in Lithuania. Conversely, some families are pulled to immigrate to their new home. They're pulled by visions of a better life, a promised land. The California Gold Rush was a pull immigration. And so in part was the migration of Eastern European Jews that my grandmother's family came with. They called America the Golden Medina. In Yiddish, that means the land of opportunity, the land of milk and honey. Push and pull forces operate together, and millions of people move across the globe. We see them walking along roads, carrying everything they can. We've seen them recently, haven't we? We know. We see them getting on ships, crossing oceans. Telling your family history, I believe, is an endeavor of great value. It clarifies so much. First of all, for the author, I am so much more aware now of everything that went into my being born in this country. So fortunate a life, good education, good food, good work, ease of living. So many people don't have that. And for the rest of the family, and the extended family, and the other families, there are always parallels, similarities, and differences. And how we see these deepens our understanding. Every family story helps us understand and relate to all the others, and to our larger story, the story of the human race. I would like to thank my volunteer assistant today, Sue Korn, who is going to be the person who does, and right now,
I hope I do it.
next slide.
Okay.
She is an intermediate technical person. She will be doing good. This is my book cover, Stitching a Life. It was my hope I could share my family story when I wrote Stitching a Life, an immigration story. There's so much in the news about immigration. I wanted to put that because it's such a big part of my story. I love the cover. My publisher, She Writes Press, created this cover for me. I want to tell you just a little bit about them. But with the cover, they sent me 5 amazing covers, and I had to choose the best one. I definitely chose the best one, but it wasn't easy. I loved the young girl. It could have been my 16-year-old grandmother who arrived in New York City in 1900. She's dressed simply, without fuss or expense, as would have been a recently arrived and poor young girl. I loved that she was looking out over New York Harbor, because New York is the setting for my book. And in the distance is the Statue of Liberty, which plays a big part in my book as it welcomes newly arriving immigrants. Today you would never see grass like that in New York. It would only be concrete. But then it would have been grass, a little wild, untamed, rough. On the front and back cover, you can see across the top, are Lithuanian embroidery patterns, which tie into the story as certain characters embroider these very patterns, just as was done in the old country. There's quite a bit of sewing in my book. My character works a sewing machine for her job in the New York City garment industry. Other characters do this Lithuanian embroidery, and a glorious wedding dress gets designed and created for my happy ending. All this stitching echoes and resonates into the title, Stitching a Life. Just a word about my publisher. Next slide, please. This is the website of She Writes Press. As you can see, they claim they are an award-winning hybrid publisher of books by women authors, and often about women characters. They're in the Bay Area, and they were founded and are now led by Brooke Warner. Brooke lived in Nevada City for a long time, so some of you may know her. What does a hybrid publisher mean? Most of you may know this, you may not. I didn't. For anyone who doesn't know, it means that the author shares some of the expenses for the publication. Since the economic crisis in 2008, all the big publishers, Random House, Simon & Schuster, they no longer publish unknown writers. They can't afford to take the chance. So hybrid publishers appeared to fill that gap. Hybrid publishers are not vanity press. Don't be confused. They have very high standards and rigorous review. I was thrilled when they accepted me. Next slide, please. I just want to give a little shout out to my writing teacher, Pat Miller. You may know Pat. She was a Gold Country writer, speaker, standing, we were at the church back then, but in my position virtually. And she also lived in Nevada City and knew Brooke and recommended She Writes Press to me. Next slide, please. So here's an outline for my talk today. Try to be organized. First, a little about me. And Margie covered quite a lot of that, so I will cut and be brief. I want to tell you a little about my background, my education, what I do besides write. I do way too much. I'm sure some of you relate. Then some of the story of my book. I'd love to just share the story with you and read some passages that are my favorites. Then I'd like to talk about the resources for finding the historical material for your family history and the process. And finally, I would like to talk about why writing this book was spiritually important to me. We were just talking, as some of us were saying, that writing is a spiritual undertaking for many people. It's an art form, and there's always the spirit when you're creating art. Next slide, about me. It took me 4 years to write this book. I do a lot of other things. I am not a full-time writer. But I would like to tell you a little bit about some of those other things and my history. I grew up mostly in New York, and that was very useful writing the book because the novel is set in New York. I grew up with a sense of place about New York. I know the Bronx is up and the Battery's down. I couldn't hang out in the village enough when I was 16. I was thrilled that my first boyfriend was from Flatbush. Such a romantic place. I'll talk more about sense of place when I discuss resources. I was an English major, and as everyone in the Gold Country Writer novel critique group knows, all of us English majors consider it our personal responsibility to guard the English language against any and all misuse and abuse.
Amen.
You've encountered this, and some of you subscribe. Good. English majors unite. Plus, comma, I love commas. After college, I went to art school for 2 years and developed a great love of painting and art in general. Of course, that paid nothing, but it was fun, and I showed my work in a local gallery. I taught high school English, and I taught for the Head Start program as a nursery school for 3- and 4-year-olds, still going on. But teaching for me was always something to fall back on. You know, my parents told me, get a teaching degree, you can fall back on it. And but it never fired my imagination, as much as I do respect those who pursue it. I have a great respect for teachers. But in the early 1980s, I discovered computers. I could not get enough of them. I went back to school, got a degree in computer science, and from that day forward, I can honestly say to you, my work days were all play days.
Wow.
I loved it. I did computer programming. I was always happy writing code, creating my little cyber worlds that no one in the world understood but me. My boss couldn't tell me what to do because he didn't understand it. It was great. Eventually, I became a programming manager for a Fortune 500 company. Someone mentioned Fortune 500 companies today.
Wow.
And in contrast, I think it was Sue, in contrast to this group, and to the openness and kindness that prevails here, and that many of us are, I certainly am older, and said we know who we are, so we don't have to prove much. But of course, you know, in Fortune 500, it's quite the opposite. So I worked in corporate America for 12 years. I made a lot of money. It was great.
Yeah.
Otherwise, I don't know. Between college and art school and going back for a degree in computer science, you can see I really liked school. I was a little schizophrenic because here I was working for a Fortune 500 company in computer programming, but I also thought of myself as an artist. When the internet came in the early 1900s, I was one of the few people who knew both computers and art and design. There were computer programmers out there, but they didn't know red from green. There were plenty of graphic designers, but they were scared to death of that Mac that they were going to have to learn. And they all did. But I was in that spot where I had both of those disparate skills, and it was great. I moved to Auburn. I founded my own website design company, Parallax Design Group, and I did websites for a living for local businesses for many years. I'm now retired, but I volunteer to maintain websites, as Margie mentioned, including Gold Country Riders. And I enjoy that very much. I kind of see my mission as helping people with the computer. I love to do that. So I've had some nice experiences with many of you, Dorothy, and others that we've worked together to get their presence on our website, Gold Country Riders website, just right to the way they want it. So if you want any changes to your membership page, you just email me. Next slide.
Okay.
This Stitching a Life is my second book. This is my first book. I published it myself on Amazon. I created the cover. I created the Kindle edition. It was so much work. I can't tell you what a great change it was to have a publisher who did all of that for me. But it was good. I learned a lot. Next slide. I'd like to tell you a bit about the story in my book. It's the story of my grandmother, and it's a true story. It's as true as I could make it. Every time I had a fact, that was my rule. If I had a fact, it went in. If I didn't know, hey, it's a novel. I made it up. So that was fun. My grandmother was born Hinda Breakstone in Lithuania. She changed her name to Helen because she thought that was more of a New World name. At least that's what I made up in the book. And I have her do that right when she sees the Statue of Liberty. She thinks of Helen of Troy, another woman, who launched ships, and changes her name. The Breakstone family had a dairy farm in Lithuania. They were poor, but they had enough to eat, and they had a good life. But at that time, Lithuania was part of Russia, and the new Tsar was intensely anti-Semitic. They were promoting hatred all over Lithuania. Greater and greater restrictions were applied to the Jews. One of the most damaging of these I'd like to describe in my book. I'll read from my book. One important anti-Semitic law in Russia was that 12-year-old Jewish boys were forcibly drafted into the Russian army for 25 years. Once in the army, their treatment was miserable. The boys were taunted for being Jews, forced to eat pork and other foods against their religion. ridiculed, and condemned to a life of misery. When a boy was released, he would be 37 years old, more than half his life over, family connections lost, bad health, and no prospects. He would be forever altered, always to carry the traumatic memories of violence and the emotional scars of a cruel life. Boys over the age of 12 were cutting off their index fingers. The Army wouldn't draft anyone who was missing their trigger finger. So my story starts in chapter 1 with the Russian army galloping up to the family home, my grandmother's family home, and demanding that they turn over Max, the oldest boy who's just turned 12. I wanted to kind of start the book with a bang, you know. Get in late, get out early. My grandmother saves her brother in a creative way, which I won't tell you. I hoped it would be an exciting scene to bring to the reader. The violence of the soldiers is frightening, and I hoped it would communicate the danger that is motivating the rest of the story. Because my novel is young adult, I skirted the edges of the violence rather than laying it out in full view. My interviewer in a recent interview asked me, why didn't you talk about sexual violence? That's why I thought it was even more effective to portray the violence, with the soldiers kind of wrecking the house, and rather than going so deeply into it, and to protect young adult readers. As a result of this incident where the soldiers came, the family sits down and makes a plan to save their 4 sons. They will go to the New World. Papa goes first. He crosses the ocean to New York City, and a few months later he sends the money for my grandmother to cross. She's 16, and she crosses alone. I love that I know the date. She arrived in New York on August 8, 1900. There's so much out there. I'll show you how I found that out later. The trip must have been very difficult. I read online about traveling in steerage with over 1,000 people in a giant below-decks bay. During storms, they were locked in for days, the boat crashing about in the water, and water splashing in through the doors, and not nearly enough bathrooms. Finally, they arrived. I read online about a special phenomenon of great joy and singing and dancing that would break out on immigrant ship after ship when they arrived in New York Harbor and when they saw the Statue of Liberty. Next slide. I wove that into my book, and I'd like to read you a page from there. Today, she would walk off the ship into New York City. The ship slowed and finally entered the Narrows into New York Harbor. Hinda could now see the statue that she had heard so much about. Gradually it grew as they made their way closer across the water. She could feel her heart pounding. They might still be on the ship, but they had arrived. Everyone was transformed, transfixed, staring up at this great lady who faced them from hundreds of feet above. She had only been in the harbor for 10 years. The statue was expected to age to the beautiful blue-green color of weathered copper, but today, her original copper still gleamed like gold in the sun. Hinda had read all about this lady, and she knew the history. Her full name was Liberty, enlightening the world. But nothing prepared her for the actual sight. The flowing grace of the robes, the nobility of her proud head, and the one arm raised high. The lady faced out to sea, so that she greeted everyone who arrived, Hinda included. With her arm reaching toward the sky, she raised the torch of freedom, of democracy. Lady Liberty welcomed everyone and everyone alike. Her welcome was as warm to those in steerage as it was to those in first class. Hinda felt tears in her eyes. Soon, everyone around her on the boat was either laughing or crying. More and more, the sounds of joy predominated. Whole families joined in song. Everyone was hugging and kissing. A spontaneous celebration had broken out. No more czars or kings in America. From now on, people would know best what the people wanted and needed. I think that's my favorite part of the whole book. Slide number 10, please, next slide. My grandmother lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, where many immigrants came. Starting in the 1850s, for over 100 years, I think people still come there today. The Jews from Eastern Europe were just the latest wave in about 1900. This beautiful quotation from Lawrence J. Epstein's At the Edge of a Dream is the opening paragraph of my book. The Lower East Side of Manhattan was Plymouth Rock to the more than 2 million Jews who came to the New World between 1880 and 1920. 73% of them were Russians. I didn't know that either. Isn't that astounding? And I love that image of Plymouth Rock. My husband's family came over on the Mayflower, so I have my own Plymouth Rock. The Lower East Side was a vibrant neighborhood, as you can see. An immigrant could start a business by renting a push cart for a day. It didn't cost much, and they could sell anything they could get their hands on. Many newly arrived Jews worked in the New York City garment industry. I didn't know what my grandmother worked at, so I gave her a job running a sewing machine making clothing in the schmata trade. Everyone called the garment industry the schmata trade. Schmata is Yiddish for a cloth or a headscarf, the schmata trade. My story continues as Helen and her father worked tirelessly to bring the oldest boys over before the oldest boy, the 12-year-old, Max, over before the army can get him. Finally, after a few years of sustained and focused saving and determination, the entire family is reunited in the New World, and the danger is finally past. Once the danger was past, I felt like writing a love story. So at this point, my grandmother meets my grandfather, and we have courtship, and we go to Staten Island on the ferry on a date, and we go to Coney Island on a date, and it ends in a big wedding. Next slide. This picture's on my website. It's my website. And I wanted to just mention to you, my website is maryhelenfein.com. Easy to remember, E before I, in the Fein part. Mary, and I was interviewed by the Tenement Museum, which I'll talk more about when I talk about places. And that's the link to the interview if you're interested. Next slide. Oh no. Well, that was a little premature, but that's fine. Yeah, next slide. Good, that's it. Okay, so next thing I want to talk about is what resources will help you to explore your own family history. What helped me? Where do we find all the important background information that will set the scene for our story? What resources do we have? I had a long list of resources, and I looked at it and I said, this is really people, places, and things. So that's how I've divided it up. And then at the end, people, again, but people who know writing. So let's look at people. Next slide, please. As I said, my first rule was that I used everything that I actually knew, and then I made up the rest. So we had family stories, and I'm sure you do too. Every family story found its way into my book. Was it really true that my grandmother spent the night under the boardwalk at Coney Island before they were married? In that day and age of propriety and chaperones? Into the book it went. Every teenager knows how to do it. You make up a story that you're staying at your girlfriend's house. And then you have to accidentally miss the last train back to the city. What can you do? You have to sleep under the boardwalk. And this opened up research into what the beach was like in 1905, how far the subway went, what time was the last train. I have to look all this stuff up, and it's all there. And I've discovered the fabulous amusement park was there, and the ride on the moon, and the ride on the camel, into the book. Was it true that her landlady didn't like her using the iron each morning before work to get the wrinkles out of her blouse? This landlady was a family villain 20 years later. Into the book. But I changed things. If you're writing a novel, you can change things. The former villain now became a warm cousin. The irons, I had never thought about irons before electricity. They were little pieces of iron. They had a handle, and they were shaped like an iron, because you need that point. But and you heated them on the wooden stove. You just put the iron on the wooden stove, but you needed two, because they didn't stay hot very long. So you used one, and then when it stopped working, the other one was hot, and you switched back and forth. You know, I just love that little household detail. And when I went to the Tenement Museum, and I saw the stove, the iron stove, there were two irons sitting on it.
Oh, wow.
I was thrilled. Next slide, please. When I had my interview with the Tenement Museum, I had grown up knowing my grandmother was a breakstone. This was a personal memory. And she went to the Breakstone family reunions every year. They were in Chicago. And she had these photos of the Breakstone family. They were this wide and they were this high. And they were just, 100 people all lined up smiling who came every year to be together. So Breakstone's a famous name in New York City because two cousins from the Lithuania dairy went to New York and founded the Breakstone Dairy. So if you grew up in New York, you drank Breakstone milk and you ate Breakstone cottage cheese. When I had my interview at the Tenement Museum, they showed me this Breakstone box, and I'd never seen that. I was so thrilled. The next slide, please. Staying with people for a while here as a resource. This is my grandmother. My personal memories of her played a very big part in writing the book. She was fun. She had a good sense of humor. She was sharp as a tack. She was loving, and she was generous.
Who's the baby?
That's my Uncle Joe, who to me was always like this old guy, and I loved it when I saw this picture. I wrote this book because my grandmother was such an important person in my life. I spent many years with her, and all my cousins agree that I was her favorite. But none of them begrudge me that, because my father and mother were too young when they got married. My mother was 18 when I was born, and my parents were divorced by the time I was 3. My grandmother stepped into the breach. She took me under her wing, she kept me at her house as much as possible, and she just showed me her love. Next slide. She was the one who came to my college graduation. I truly believe without her, my life would never have been as happy as it has been. I wrote this book to honor her, to tell her story, to give my thanks. Next slide. Okay, people, places. Let's move on to the resource of places. I think a sense of place is very important in fiction. It serves as a ground and a grounding device for the story and the characters. Having a sense of the place that you're writing about is very important. Visit if you can. I grew up in New York, and I love New York. I was lucky that I knew the setting so well and could convey a sense of the city and my pride in the city. Lithuania. Who knows anything about Lithuania? Some people do. My husband and I were on a cruise, and I realized that it ended in Oslo. And I thought, boy, how far is that from Lithuania? It's an hour flight and a $100 ticket. I was thrilled. We spent 3 days there. Vilnius, the capital, is a World Heritage Site. I can't recommend it enough. There was nobody there. People don't even know. We went to my grandmother's village, and we looked for the dairy farm. We walked up and down the streets with a guide who spoke the language. We talked to people. Nobody remembered the dairy from 120 years ago. But the trip was far from wasted. I got to see flowers that grew alongside the road. Into the book. I discovered the river that runs through her town was a great, lazy, winding river. I went back to my manuscript, deleted the raging river that I had imagined, put it with the real river. In her village, at one point, I looked up, next slide, please, and saw a 6-foot wide bird in an enormous nest at the top of the tree and 3 little white birds skittering around her. I saw this in several yards, and we were told it was good luck if a stork nested in your yard. I'll read you that little part of my book. Hinda was very curious to check up on the new bird's nest that had appeared in the family yard. The nest was several feet across. There was an enormous mother bird on top of the tallest tree in the yard. The bird was a white stork. Stork nests were frequently seen in the spring and early summer in Lithuania. The bird was held in very high regard. People celebrated Lapwing Day, the day the storks returned from their winter migration. They still told the old story that the stork brought new babies, and now you can see that they could actually be strong enough to hold them. But no one would ever dare to harm a stork. It was regarded as very good luck if a stork chose your yard to build their nest. The mother stork stood up as Hinda approached. She flapped her wide, black-tipped wings to announce herself, and you could see the several little storks at the mother's feet. The bird had arrived and started building her nest the very day after Papa's departure. To Hinda and to the entire family, it was a sign that the family plan was going to succeed. Storks were always a good sign. Well, just to continue with places, next slide, please, Sue. This is the Great Hall at Ellis Island. I spent the day there, and I learned so much about the rigorous testing that immigrants had to go through. Hey, if you traveled on that ship first class, you didn't have to go through anything. But if you were in steerage, they put you through tests for a whole day, and it was scary, because if you failed, they sent you back to Europe on the next boat. Can you imagine? I love describing Ellis Island because I'd seen it with my own eyes. I knew those tiles on the floor were red. I knew they were shiny. I knew the staircase up to the examination room was steep, and if anybody got out of breath, they put a chalk mark on their back to say, hey, this person doesn't belong in this country, they're too weak. I knew the benches where the immigrants sat for hours waiting for their examinations, that they were long, wooden, scratched with years of use. There's no substitute for this kind of detail to make things real for your reader. Next slide. This is the Tenement Museum. The Lower East Side of Manhattan is literally thousands of buildings that look exactly like this. They're all 5 stories. They all have the 2 storefronts. They have the windows. They have the fire escape. So when Hinda first sees her new home, her father meets her at the boat and they walk to the Lower East Side. And she's just, a 16-year-old girl from another country, from a rural community. She's never even seen a 2-story building. And here's this. I'll read to you. Helen, she's Helen now, took in the store windows and the entire building. She looked up toward the rooftop and saw an exposed, rickety metal stairway hugging the outside of the brick wall and going all the way up to the roof. Papa, is this how we have to go up to our quarters? Papa grinned at Helen. No, my dear, those stairs are for escaping from a fire. If there were a fire inside, the fire escape would be the only way down. Don't worry, inside the front door is a regular, normal staircase. Helen shuddered at the idea of a fire in a tall building, something she had never even thought about. She set the thought aside and followed Papa up the steps. Next slide. Within the Tenement Museum are apartments that are fully fleshed out and decorated for different periods of time. The Irish, the Germans in the 1850s, the Jews in 1900s. So you can see just how they lived. This is my grandmother's kitchen, I'm sure. And most of the indoor scenes in my book are set in these tenement 3-room apartments. So what a great resource. And that little arrow is pointing to the iron. Next slide. People, places, things. What things can help us as we reconstruct our family history? The internet was the most amazing resource. My cousin, who's a writer, said to me, Google, what was the East Side like the Lower East Side like in 1900? I did that, and I found volumes of information. I didn't know you could do that. And I've been doing it ever since. I have a question, how do you make ribs in the oven? You just ask for what you want. I Googled what was happening in 1900. President Theodore Roosevelt's niece Eleanor was getting married to this unknown law student from Columbia at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Into the book. Her dress appears on the front page of the New York Times. My grandmother's getting married. They copy that dress and she wears it down the aisle. And her mother makes the lace. I Googled again. What else was happening in 1900? Next slide, please. P.T. Barnum and the Greatest Show on Earth were in New York. Into the book it went. Barnum walked a long line of elephants across this brand new Brooklyn Bridge, the longest bridge in the world. His favorite elephant, Jumbo, led the parade. Everyone in New York now had faith that the bridge really was strong enough to hold all those people, all those horses, all those carriages. After this, people trusted the bridge. The next slide. Legal documents. I was able to find the ship's manifest for the SS Barbarossa that my grandmother came over on. Of course, it's incomprehensible. But I knew she was on line 10. I think I got it wrong in my book. It said line 11. But I put it in Photoshop and blew it up. Next slide. And there in red is her line. And when I have it in Photoshop, I can blow it up. I can see Hinda Breakstone. And here, in this column, is who's going to meet this person when they arrive in New York. And it says father. That's how I knew he came first. Little things that change the whole story. Next slide. People who do genealogy, we were just talking about this with some of you, love Ancestry.com. I built a family tree for her family in Ancestry because I couldn't keep Max and Julius and all the boys who was older and who was younger. I kept it all straight right there at Ancestry.com. And also Ancestry has links to things like a ship's manifest. It does a lot. I don't know everything it does. There was also a Breakstone family website. That was very useful. The guy who built that website, I named one of my characters after him because I was so grateful. Next slide. The last resource I wanted to mention is people who know about writing. Once you're at the point where you want to take input from others, and for me that's not early. I need to be on my own for a long time before anybody else gets anything to say. But when you get to that point, there are friends, family, writing teachers, editors, my novel writers critique group. I could never have completed either of my books without them. If I don't have a deadline, I'll do it tomorrow. But I had deadlines. And I'm so thrilled to see books by Pauline and Anne and other people who were in that novel writer group on the table back there. I hadn't known that Anne's book was out, and I read Pauline's book, which I highly recommend. Fudge, it's on the table back there. Help can come from unexpected people. I have a friend who's a therapist, and she got very excited about helping me with my book. This was all her idea, but we sat down side by side and we went through all the scenes in the book, and whenever there was intense emotion between people, she helped me. She said, now how are you going to show that? And so I would add little things, like someone would touch the other person's arm or feel a clench in their stomach. You know, and I went through the whole book. She was so generous to think of doing that. It was all her idea. I was very grateful. So I think my book really benefited from having more emotional reality. Okay, let's talk a little bit about process. Next slide. Basically, I think everyone's is different.
That's a good slide.
When I write the book from page 1 to the end, in order. I'm careful about punctuation and every detail. Pretty much that's how I do it. I understand that many successful writers scratch down what I would find a terrifying big mess, but which for them is a gold mine, raw ore that they will then work with until they have molded it and polished it and turned it into something beautiful. So everything in between is how people work. And of course that will apply to family history. Once my book is complete, I go back over it 1,000,000 times. I add detail. I add history that I find on the internet. Oh, that could go right there. Things that were happening at the time that fit in with the story. I change little phrasing to make it more musical or clearer, more clear. There's no end for me. So far, a book has never been finished or perfect. I can always improve it more. But there just comes a time when you say, I'm done. I believe a book can be infinitely improved. But one day you say enough. Last slide. Spiritual purpose. So often family history is set in the larger context of world events. Stitching together these threads has made me very grateful for the courage that went into coming to the New World. Every family story lets the readers make connections with their own family stories. Their family may have emigrated from South America. They may have been pushed out of Africa. But there will be great similarities wherever a family picks up and moves everything to a new and unknown place. The push and the pull. Stories of mass migrations resonate for everyone just because the story is part of human history by which we have all been formed. Last slide. Next slide. I was deeply interested in what pushed my ancestors to take their journey. I knew the forces were enormous. I've always thought that the Eastern European Jews, like my grandmother, for them it would be like getting on a spaceship to go to the new settlement on Mars. We would leave behind everything we had ever known, every person we had ever known, everything that was familiar. We would never come back. We could never come back. The journey was too difficult to make twice, and too expensive to make twice in one lifetime. We wouldn't know too much about how things would work out on Mars in our new settlement. We didn't know if we would fit in, if we'd be able to have a life as happy as the life we were leaving. The courage it took to face facts and pick up and leave is astounding to me and inspires me to make the most of what I have been given.
Wow.